My children told me, "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives. You need to stay on your own and figure it out." So I did exactly that. I stopped calling them and I called my lawyer instead. Weeks later, when they desperately tried entering my estate, my newly hired private security escorted them out. I am Gerald. I just turned 71 years old. A retired architect by trade, I've spent my whole life constructing foundations in concrete and in love alike. My home is on a 15-acre estate in the Virginia countryside, a place I designed and raised with my own two hands side by side with my late wife Loretta. She passed 5 years ago, and ever since the quiet that fills this sprawling craftsman-style home has been my only steady companion. On the evening of my 71st birthday, I sat alone at the custom-built walnut dining table. I'd spent the afternoon preparing a pot roast, holding on to some stubborn hope that my children would remember the date and walk through that front door. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. Before we go any further, if a story like this one speaks to you, tap that subscribe button so the next one comes to you automatically. And I'd love to know, is this your first time sitting down with one of these stories, or have you been here a while? Drop a quick note in the comments and let me know. Now, a brief word before we begin. Some elements of this story have been shaped for dramatic storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. The antique mantel clock chimed in the hallway, each note landing like a small wound marking the hours I sat alone. I reached for my phone and called Caleb first. 38 years old, always sprinting toward the next big idea, always landing in the same place, buried under the wreckage of ventures that never panned out. Voicemail. I tried Naomi next. 41. A real estate agent whose entire existence was a performance staged for people with more money than she'd ever honestly earn. Then something unexpected happened. The line connected and I could hear them both. They'd looped each other in. "Happy birthday to me," I said, pushing what I hoped sounded like warmth into my voice. "Are you two still planning on dinner? I put together the pot roast you always loved." What came back through the speaker wasn't warmth. It was the sound of crystal clinking low conversation in the background, the unmistakable texture of a restaurant neither of them had thought to invite me to. Caleb spoke first, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man interrupted during something he considered far more important. "Dad, you're on speaker. We're swamped right now. There's a client dinner we can't get out of." Before I could even form the question of why no one had bothered to tell me our plans were gone, Naomi stepped in. No hesitation, no softness. "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives to manage. You need to stay on your own and figure it out. We are not your babysitters." Then silence. The call was over. I sat motionless in that wide, hollow dining room, the dead tone droning against my ear. My eyes moved across the rooms Loretta and I had shaped together, the home we had willed into existence through decades of sacrifice. We gave them everything. And sitting there alone on my birthday, the truth of what I was to them finally landed without softening. Not a father who was grieving, not a widower reaching across the distance for one evening of connection. A nuisance, a burden they had to manage. I did not cry. Architects don't mourn cracks, they trace them back to the source. And the source was clear. The foundation beneath this family had been rotting for years. I simply hadn't let myself see it. I pushed back from the table, leaving the pot roast untouched, and walked down the corridor to my study. I pulled up my secure banking portal and sat with it open in front of me. What I saw there every month had been my quiet act of loyalty, a steady $12,000 flowing out to them without ceremony or credit. Caleb's failed startups ate through money like kindling. Naomi's curated image of success required constant fuel. I had been that fuel. I told myself it was a safety net. I never once made them feel it. Then a red alert blinked at the top of the screen. Fraud prevention. An inquiry had been flagged concerning the deed to my estate. Something cold moved through me as I opened the message. Caleb and Naomi had gone to a lender together and submitted my 15-acre estate as collateral on a $500,000 commercial bridge loan. The paperwork was there in front of me, and at the bottom of every authorization page sat my digital signature rendered so cleanly I had to look twice to confirm it wasn't real, a forgery. They had routed around my primary email, captured the verification codes, and signed my name, counting on the assumption that a man my age wouldn't know where to look or how to find it. They had written me off as a senile old man who would simply lose his home one quiet afternoon without ever understanding why. The nerve of it was breathtaking. In the same hour they had told me to manage my own life, they were moving to strip away the ground beneath my feet, to prop up the lifestyles they had never actually earned. This wasn't rudeness. This was wire fraud. Federal. I stayed at that desk a long time, the screen casting pale light across my hands. The anger burned and then passed through me, and what was left on the other side was something colder and far more useful. Clarity. The kind that arrives when grief is finished, and what remains is purpose. I pulled the forged documents. I gathered the bank records stretching back years. Everything went into one encrypted folder, sealed and waiting. Then I picked up the phone. I found Caleb's contact, that photo from his graduation, grinning like the world owed him everything. Gone. I found Naomi's laughing in the backyard of the very house they'd just tried to steal. Gone. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I scrolled to the letter C and pressed call. 2 rings, then a familiar weathered voice. "Clifford!" I said flat and even. "It's Gerald. I need to cut some dead weight loose, and I need a gate." The next morning, I was up before the light had fully settled over the Virginia countryside. I put on the suit I'd last worn to Loretta's funeral, drove 2 hours into Richmond, and rode an elevator to the top floor of a glass tower, where Clifford had run his practice for as long as I could remember. Late 60s iron-minded, the kind of attorney who treats legal strategy the way a surgeon treats a scalpel. He met me at the boardroom entrance, read my face in a single glance, and stepped aside without a word. I laid everything across the polished cherry wood table. The forged applications. The IP records placing the submission squarely at Caleb's corporate office. The full history of the $12,000 monthly allowance I'd been quietly providing for years. Clifford worked through it without speaking. When he set the papers down and raised his eyes, there was nothing soft in them. "Gerald," he said, his voice low and measured, "they crossed a line you cannot uncross. This is federal wire fraud. I can have them in handcuffs by tomorrow morning." I shook my head. "No, Clifford. Prison is the easy road. The moment they're behind bars, they rewrite the story. They become the wronged ones, and I'm the father who put them there. That's not what I want." I let a beat pass. "They told me to stand on my own and figure it out. I'm going to honor that request. Every resource they've been drawing from me, silently without gratitude, I'm going to shut it off. All of it." The next 4 hours were methodical. Clifford mapped out the legal framework, while I watched the scaffolding of their comfortable lives begin to come apart on paper. But there was something else I hadn't told them, something neither Caleb nor Naomi had ever suspected. As far as they knew, my worth was the house, and whatever sat in standard retirement accounts. What I had never shown them, what I had shielded from them deliberately for more than 20 years, so they would build character instead of waiting for a windfall, was that the 15 acres under the house were just the beginning. Long before the suburbs started creeping outward, I had quietly acquired the commercial zoning rights to 50 additional acres of prime surrounding land. That ground was worth millions. I had grown an empire in plain sight and total silence. They believed they were snatching a house. They were discarding a kingdom. We finished the paperwork. Clifford regarded me with an expression I recognized, measured respect, edged with something grave. "Are you certain you're prepared for what comes next, Gerald? Once the money disappears, they'll be at your door." I stood straightened my jacket and turned toward the floor-to-ceiling glass and the Richmond skyline beyond it. "Let them come," I said. "I am the architect. I raised everything they have, and I know precisely how to bring it down." Down below, traffic moved through Richmond in its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to what was being decided 30 floors up. Clifford moved without hesitation, the practiced hand of a man who had unwound far larger structures than this. The first order of business was the bridge loan. One call to the bank's fraud division, the forged signatures as proof, and the $500,000 transaction was stopped before it could breathe. I sat across from his desk and watched the dismantling begin. Then the joint accounts. 2 high-yield accounts I'd kept open over the years, with Caleb and Naomi as authorized users. What I had intended as a cushion, they had treated as an ATM with no limit. An emergency authorization mandate locked them solid. No movement in or out. The line was cut. And last came the transfers themselves, that $12,000 a month, draining quietly from my estate, trust into their personal accounts month after month, invisible to everyone but me. the engine behind every illusion of success they'd ever projected. I told Clifford to end them, permanently. But I wasn't finished. I knew my children's rhythms, their obligations, their timelines, the exact architecture of their dependence. Wednesday. In 48 hours, the illusion they'd been living inside would crack open. I knew this because I'd spent a decade patching their messes before they even noticed them. Friday was when the automatic drafts cleared. Caleb wore the label serial entrepreneur, the way other men wore designer watches as a signal to people he wanted to impress. The reality underneath that label was considerably less polished. His current venture, a tech consulting firm that generated little beyond inflated expense reports, ran payroll every other Friday morning. I remembered the day he came to me 3 years ago with a slick presentation and a pitch for seed money. I wrote the check. That's what fathers do, they choose to believe. But for the past 6 months, the only thing keeping his small staff paid on time was the quiet transfer leaving my account each month. He had stacked his entire operation on top of my invisible generosity, trusting the net would always be there. On Friday morning, when he moved to push payroll through the wall, would be solid, and there would be no way around it. No advance notice from me, no buffer, just a hard, insufficient funds rejection. He would have to stand in front of his employees and account for why their checks hadn't come through. Naomi's reckoning was set for the same morning, though what she stood to lose was something she prized even above financial stability. Her standing. She and Brett held memberships at the most exclusive country club in the county, the kind of place where old money circulated quietly, and everyone pretended not to notice who belonged and who didn't. Their monthly dues, along with the lease payments on the 2 luxury vehicles parked in their driveway, were all scheduled to pull from the joint account I had just frozen solid. A declined payment there wouldn't stay private. The club had a well-earned reputation for handling delinquent accounts quickly and without discretion. Naomi would try to charge a mimosa at the clubhouse on Friday afternoon, and her card would be turned down in front of the exact audience she had spent years performing for. Swift, public, and complete. I left Clifford's office carrying a folder of confirmation receipts and pointed the car back toward the Virginia countryside. 2 hours and not a word on the radio. For 38 years I had organized my life around their crises. Caleb needed capital. I wrote the check. Naomi was overextended. I smoothed things over. I had built a 15-acre estate with my own hands and let my children treat the man who built it like an inconvenience they could invoice. As the long gravel driveway came into view, the weight of what I had set in motion finally settled over me. I parked and sat there a moment, looking at the craftsman-style home that Loretta and I had drawn from nothing, every roofline, deliberate, every window placed to catch the morning light. We built it as a place where family would gather, a sanctuary for something that it turned out had mostly existed in our expectations. I went inside. The quiet greeted me the way it always did, but it felt different now. Not hollow, clean, like a room scrubbed bare and ready. I went to the kitchen and filled a glass with water, leaning against the counter where Loretta used to stand while she talked me through whatever was weighing on me. I could almost place her there, that steady, clear-eyed presence she carried. "Gerald," she used to say, "if you keep cushioning every fall, they'll never understand what it means to brace for one. You think you're protecting them, you're just postponing the damage." She had seen it long before I was willing to. My support hadn't built anything in them, it had only built their appetite for more. They came to believe they had a claim on my money, on my property, on my time, on my life. The 48-hour clock was running. Wednesday night stretched into Thursday. The hours moved the way they do, when you're waiting for something you can't stop, slowly and with purpose. I didn't fill the silence with television or music. I walked the property instead, pacing the perimeter, setting my hand against the bark of the old oaks, feeling the weight of the ground underfoot. I was rooting myself, steadying my mind against the force of what was coming. I checked my phone now, and then, not to reach out but to confirm the quiet still held. It did. Not a word from either of them. No call to ask how the birthday evening had gone, no message checking whether I was all right. They were deep inside their own lives with no awareness that everything beneath them had just been removed. Thursday night came in heavy. I made a plain dinner and ate at the dining room table where I had sat alone on my birthday, and I looked at the phone lying still on the wood surface. They believed they had handled me, that by telling a 71-year-old man to sort himself out, they had settled something. They didn't know their dismissal had been the very thing that unlocked the door. I slept that night the way I hadn't, since Loretta died, thoroughly, without interruption, without the low hum of worry underneath everything. The sleep of a man who has finally put something down that was never his to carry. When light came over the hills Friday morning and spread across the estate, I was already up. I made a strong pot of black coffee and took it out to the back patio. The air had that cool charge quality that comes ahead of rain, and the grounds were still. I settled into my favorite wooden porch chair, phone resting on the small table at my side. Everything was in place. The financial systems didn't need me anymore. They were running, and they were unforgiving. At 9 in the morning, the drafts would process. At 9 in the morning, accounts would lock, payments would bounce, and the full weight of the independence they had demanded would arrive at their doors all at once. I took a long sip of coffee and let the warmth move through me. I wasn't feeling vindictive. I wasn't feeling cruel. I felt the way I imagine I look when I'm watching a building fail the quiet focus of someone who drew the blueprints and already knows which wall is going to go first. All I had to do was sit still and let it happen. But I knew a financial wall alone wouldn't be sufficient. I know my children. When their cards stopped working and their accounts locked up, the first thing they would reach for wouldn't be introspection. It would be fury. They would drive out to the estate and come at the gate demanding explanations, demanding entry. The financial barrier needed a physical one to match it. I didn't look up a local contractor. I called a private firm out of Richmond that handled rapid security deployment for clients who couldn't afford to wait. I told the operations director I needed a permanent impenetrable perimeter installed at the main entrance of my 15-acre property, and I needed it standing within 24 hours. He told me that kind of timeline was unusual and would cost significantly more than standard rates. I told him that wasn't a concern and wired a $50,000 as a retainer before we ended the call. By noon on Thursday, the quiet gravel drive was unrecognizable. 3 heavy utility trucks came up the long path, trailed by a flatbed hauling massive sections of solid wrought iron. A crew of 10 men dressed in unmarked dark uniforms climbed down and moved immediately into formation. No wasted motion. No idle conversation. The foreman, a composed man who carried himself with the bearing of someone used to operating under pressure, walked the main entrance with me. He read the natural landscape, the dense tree line, the slope of the terrain, and we settled on the placement together. Within the hour, excavators were opening the earth to pour rapid cure industrial concrete for the gate pillars. The sound of the machinery rolled across the valley and broke against the hills, strange and loud against the usual stillness of the property. I stood on the porch with my coffee and watched the thick iron sections rise on chains one after another. It struck me as genuinely surreal. I had designed this land to breathe open to the sky, easy with the surrounding trees. Now I was sealing it. As the welding torches threw sparks across the entrance and the iron joints fused together in the afternoon light, my thoughts turned to Loretta, practical, clear-seeing Loretta. She had always known things about our children that I was too willing to look away from. I was the architect, always reaching to build things up, always looking to smooth the rough edges from their lives. Loretta was the realist. She understood that a foundation only becomes strong when it's left to cure under pressure. I remember clearly a rainy evening more than a decade back. We were in the living room together, and Caleb had just left after coming to ask for a sizable loan to cover the wreckage of his second failed venture. I had agreed without hesitation writing the check, before I'd even asked to see a single financial record. Loretta waited until the door closed behind him, before she turned to me, and the look on her face said everything before she spoke. "Gerald," she said, her voice quiet but carrying real weight. "You believe you're being a good father by catching them every time, but you're not. You are stealing their resilience. You are teaching them that failure carries no cost because you'll always step in to absorb it." I pushed back that night. I told her my success meant nothing if I couldn't use it to ease the path for our children. I told her Caleb just needed more time to find solid ground, and that Naomi only needed a little support to maintain the social connections that fed her real estate business. Loretta shook her head slowly, looking at me with an expression I recognized, that particular sadness of someone watching a mistake being made in real time. "You're going to ruin them, Gerald. If you never allow them to feel the pain of a scraped knee one day, they'll jump from a cliff and expect you to have a parachute waiting." She warned me that what I called generosity was quietly breeding entitlement. She told me the day would come when they stopped requesting my help and started assuming it was owed, when they stopped thinking of me as their father and started seeing me as a resource to draw from. I didn't listen. I believed my love could outpace their irresponsibility. But standing there watching the crew work the iron gates into place, I finally let in the truth I had been holding at arm's length. Loretta had been right. Right from the beginning, and my stubborn refusal to hear her had shaped the very problem I was now erecting a wall to contain. My financial enabling had quietly crippled my own children, arrested their development, and turned them into adults who could only take. The afternoon gave way to evening, and the construction crew kept working under the glow of towering halogen work lights. Once the iron gates were secured to the concrete pillars, a technology team moved in to handle the hardware. This was no standard keypad setup. I had requested the highest access control tier available. The technicians mounted high-definition night vision cameras at staggered angles, eliminating every blind spot along the entrance and the perimeter fencing. The feed ran directly to a secure server in my study, accessible from a tablet anywhere in the house. Then came the access terminal, a weatherproof biometric scanner mounted on a steel pedestal just outside the gate, requiring a registered fingerprint to engage the hydraulic motors driving the heavy iron doors. I stepped out into the cool evening air and pressed my thumb to the glowing reader. It chimed softly and the gates drew open, smooth, silent, unhurried. I watched them close again. The iron panels met with a low, resonant thud of finality. The physical barrier was complete. Nobody was coming up that driveway without my express biological authorization. The security foreman handed me a master control tablet and a set of encrypted physical backup keys. He told me the perimeter sensors would trigger an immediate alert on my devices if anyone tried to scale the surrounding walls or tamper with the gate. The firm also offered a direct line to their dispatch center, with a private armed response unit guaranteed to arrive within 10 minutes of any triggered alarm. I thanked him, then walked back up the long gravel drive as the utility trucks packed out and disappeared into the dark. The deep quiet of the Virginia countryside night settled back in, but it carried a different quality now. The open, exposed estate I had lived on was gone. What stood in its place felt more like a fortress. I went inside, locked the heavy front door, and carried the security tablet to my desk in the study. The screens showed the iron gate standing firm and unyielding beneath the perimeter lights. The driveway beyond it was empty. The road passed, that black. I sat in my leather chair and let my eyes rest on the framed photograph of Loretta on the bookshelf. I whispered into the quiet an apology for how many years it had taken me to finally absorb what she had tried to teach. I had spent so long trying to be their parachute. I had finally built the wall they needed to hit instead. I switched off the desk lamp and went up to sleep, knowing that when Friday morning arrived, the financial charge I had set would go off, and my children would discover they were locked out of the kingdom they had always assumed was theirs. Friday's dawn came the way it always does, indifferent to what it was delivering, but the air had a charged weight to it. I was awake before 6. Pale light edged through the bedroom blinds and drew long shadows across the hardwood floor that Loretta and I had laid ourselves. I didn't rush. I showered, shaved with care, and put on a comfortable pair of slacks and a clean-collared shirt. This was the day the illusions came apart, and I intended to be fully present when they did. I went downstairs, the house wide and quiet around me. I measured out my dark roast, listened to the coffee machine work, let the smell of it settle into the kitchen. Then, as I poured the first cup, the silence broke. My phone on the granite counter began to vibrate, once, then again. Then in a rapid, unbroken string, the screen flashing against the dark tile like a distress signal. The first dominoes were falling. I picked it up. The first wave of panic was Caleb's. 7 texts sent inside 3 minutes, the tone escalating fast from confusion into something closer to desperation. Dad, did you change your bank routing number? Dad, the transfer didn't go through. Call me back immediately. Dad, my payroll just bounced. My employees are threatening to walk out. Pick up the phone. I read each one without hurry, letting the shape of his situation take form. I could picture him exactly sitting in his overpriced glass-walled corporate office in Richmond, sweating through that tailored designer suit as the floor dissolved under him. For years, he had performed the role of the successful, untouchable tech visionary, distributing paychecks that were funded entirely by my silent foolishness. Without my money propping the whole thing up, he was an imposter sitting behind a large overhead and a drained account. The invisible net was gone, and he was falling towards something he had never once prepared himself to land on. The screen lit up again before it could dim. Naomi this time, the messages arriving in broken, scattered fragments that showed exactly how fast things were unraveling for her. Dad, what is going on with the joint account? My card just declined at the country club. I am so humiliated. Brett is furious. The leasing company just flagged our luxury utility vehicles for non-payment. They are threatening repossession. Answer your phone. I took a slow sip of coffee. The bitterness of it felt appropriate. I could place her clearly in my mind standing in the marble foyer of the country club, face-burning as a cashier returned her declined card in front of the very crowd she had built her entire identity around impressing. And Brett beside her, the man who had always looked at me as though I were some relic from an era he'd moved past, suddenly registering that the lifestyle he'd bragged about was underwritten by the old man he'd openly dismissed. They were finding out in real time that an empire built on another person's money can be recalled without warning. The texts gave way to calls. Caleb twice, Naomi 3 times, then Caleb again. The phone hammered against the counter, that frantic mechanical rhythm of people who are used to being answered. I did not pick up. I didn't even press decline. I let it ring and ring, allowing them to sit inside the silence they had never expected from me. Just days before they had told me in plain terms to stop calling them, to manage my own life, to stay out of theirs. I was simply honoring their demands, giving them the hard boundary they had asked for, delivered without deviation. I silenced the ringer, slipped the phone into my pocket, and lifted my coffee mug. I carried it out to the back porch and settled into my favorite wooden porch chair. Morning dew still clung to the wide lawn, and the estate sat quietly beneath the early sun, looking as peaceful as it always had. But the landscape wasn't what held my attention. I drew the security tablet from the side table and set it on my lap. The high-definition screen showed the live feed from the iron gates at the bottom of the gravel drive, those thick metal bars standing without apology between my earned peace and the storm that was on its way. I took another measured sip of coffee, feeling something close to finality settle in my chest. For decades, I had contorted myself around their emergencies. I had trimmed back my own retirement, worn down my own peace of mind, so that they would never have to sit with the consequences of their own choices. That chapter was closed. I watched the clock on the tablet tick forward minute by minute. Their initial panic wouldn't stay as panic for long. It would curdle into rage, and rage would demand a target. They wouldn't accept a bounced payroll or a declined card as an abstract banking problem. They would need to stand in front of someone and demand an answer, and that someone had always been me. They expected to drive up here, find a lonely old man who would quietly fold and walk away with a reinstated check. I kept my gaze on the surveillance feed of the road below, still empty, still quiet. I felt no fear, no second thoughts. I simply felt ready. I breathed in the cool morning air of the Virginia countryside and waited. The silver sedan's tires bit hard into the curves of the highway. Inside, Caleb had both hands locked on the steering wheel, knuckles blanched white. His hair, usually composed down to the last detail, was damp at the temples. He was pressing the accelerator past any reasonable speed, replaying the morning's disaster in his head. Beside him, Tessa had her eyes fixed on her phone, cycling through the same banking screen over and over, as if the number might eventually change. It didn't. Caleb slapped the steering wheel and let out a sharp, frustrated shout. He told Tessa it was nothing. His father was just an old man who didn't understand technology, who probably hit the wrong button on his tablet and flagged the account by mistake. That had to be it, he said, because there was simply no other rational explanation. Tessa didn't look up from her screen. Her voice came out clipped and brittle, riding the edge of hysteria. She reminded him that her membership at the elite spa had just been declined, that the woman at the front desk had looked at her like she was there under false pretenses. She told him that if his father had wrecked their credit score because he couldn't remember a password, she was going to completely lose her mind. Caleb forced the dread down and tried to think past it. The bounced payroll alone was a problem he could barely hold in his head all at once, employees threatening to walk vendors already making calls. He needed that $12,000 transfer. He needed the joint account working. Without that invisible financial engine running quietly in the background, his entire performance as a successful tech visionary was just an empty set with no power behind it. He pressed harder on the gas, telling himself this was fixable. He would walk in, speak firmly, get the credentials, and put everything back the way it was. Some distance behind him on the same winding road, Naomi was pushing her luxury vehicle at the same desperate pace. Brett sat in the passenger seat with his arms crossed, working his jaw and muttering under his breath, pausing only to glare at the passing tree line. Naomi kept stealing glances at the rear-view mirror, watching her own expression, face still flushed, breathing still uneven. The moment at the country club hadn't faded. Her card had been handed back to her in front of people she had spent years cultivating. The club manager's voice had carried. Every head in that dining room had turned. Brett tugged at his jacket and turned toward the window, voice low and cutting. He told Naomi her father had finally lost the plot. He said they should have stepped in and taken over the finances years ago. He called his father-in-law a senile old fool fumbling around with accounts he didn't understand, and said the man had probably fallen for a phishing scam and locked everything out of pure incompetence. Naomi gripped the wheel. Her eyes were wet, but she was holding them back through force of will. She nodded, matching his anger with her own. She said her father was completely out of his depth, that she had told him to manage his own life, and now look what he'd done. She announced that when they arrived, she was taking his phone and his laptop, and she was getting power of attorney paperwork started first thing Monday morning. She would not allow an old man's fumbling to cost them everything they had built. Neither of them saw it. Not once in all that rage did it occur to Naomi or Caleb that this was deliberate. They had spent their whole adult lives drawing from their father like he was a well that refilled itself. In their understanding of him, he was a grieving widower, lonely, eager to be needed, too sentimental to ever actually cut them off. The possibility that he had the resolve to do this on purpose wasn't something their worldview had room for. They were barreling toward the estate with the righteous fury of people who believe they've been wronged by a clerical error. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle met at the base of the road leading up to the property. Caleb spotted Naomi in his mirror and leaned on the horn, a sharp shared signal of frustration. She flashed her headlights back and kept pace. The two vehicles swept up the rural road together, loud and fast, tearing through the quiet countryside like they owned every inch of it. In his car, Caleb was already rehearsing. He was going to walk through the front doors, find his father in the study, and deliver his demands in the clearest possible corporate register, the same voice he used to manage vendors and dress down underperforming staff. He pictured the old man behind his desk, looking flustered and apologetic. Caleb felt a swell of something like confidence. Caleb was the successful entrepreneur. He was the one in charge. His father was a retired man out of his depth, and this situation called for someone who knew how to handle things. In the other car, Naomi had her own script prepared. She would cry just enough, controlled enough to make him feel the weight of what his carelessness had cost her. She would describe the country club in detail, the eyes on her, the shame of it. She knew precisely how to activate his paternal guilt. She had done it before. Brett beside her was already cracking his knuckles, prepared to step in with a harder edge if the guilt routine didn't produce results fast enough. The trees rushed past their windows as the estate approached beyond the final hill. They were locked inside their own fury, blind to anything beyond it. They believed they were heading toward an unlocked door and a confused old man who would cave the moment they raised their voices. They had no concept of what was actually waiting, no picture of a fortified gate, no sense that the man inside had spent the last 48 hours building a wall specifically designed to stop them. They thought they were driving toward a quick resolution. They were racing toward the end of something they hadn't realized was already over. The sedan's expensive tires threw gravel as Caleb swung hard off the main road and onto the private lane leading up to the estate, a cloud of dust rising in his wake. He was driving at a reckless speed, propelled by some volatile blend of adrenaline and pure financial terror. He had counted on the long, curving driveway to unfurl ahead of him, a clear, open corridor straight to his father's front door. But as the vehicle cleared the last gentle rise, Caleb had to throw both feet onto the brakes with everything he had. The heavy sedan fishtailed and skidded across the pavement. The anti-lock system shuddered and shrieked as the tires bit and screamed against the asphalt. The sharp stench of burned rubber flooded the leather interior instantly. Tessa was thrown hard into her seatbelt, letting out a breathless, terrified cry. Just inches from their front bumper rose a massive, immovable wall of solid black iron. Caleb sat frozen at the wheel, gripping it so hard his hands trembled as the dust drifted slowly down over the hood. His mind simply would not accept what was filling his windshield. Where a simple open stone entryway had once stood, flanked by neatly trimmed hedges, there was now a heavily fortified security gate. Thick, impenetrable iron bars climbed high into the morning sky, set into freshly poured concrete pillars that looked more appropriate for a federal penitentiary than a retired architect's quiet home in the Virginia countryside. Sleek high-definition surveillance cameras sat mounted at the very top, their dark lenses angled directly down at the sedan. A glowing biometric access terminal stood on a heavy steel pedestal just beyond reach. This was no construction detour, no mistake. A deliberate, expensive, and absolute blockade. The shock held for only a few seconds before a blinding, entitled fury took its place. Caleb drove his open palm down onto the center of the steering wheel. The horn blared a long, aggressive echoing sound that tore apart the serene quiet of the valley. He held it down, letting it scream for a full 10 seconds, fully expecting his father to come rushing from the house in a panic. I expected the heavy gates to swing open in fearful obedience, but the iron simply stood there, completely indifferent to his corporate tantrum. Tessa covered her ears and screamed at him to stop, her voice climbing toward hysteria as the reality of their frozen accounts and this locked gate began crashing together in her mind. Just behind them, the white luxury SUV skidded to its own chaotic stop, nearly slamming into the silver sedan's rear bumper. Naomi threw her hands up in disbelief, her mouth open as she stared through the windshield at the fortress her childhood home had become. She was frantically reaching for her seatbelt when Brett was already out the door, throwing it open so hard it bounced back on its own hinges. Brett blew past the idling silver car, his face flushed a deep, furious red. A man completely accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. A mid-level manager who made a career out of bullying the people beneath him. He walked straight to the iron gate and grabbed the thick black bars with both hands, shaking them with full force. The heavy metal didn't so much as rattle. It was anchored too deep for that. Brett stepped back, chest heaving, and caught sight of the sleek access terminal on the steel pedestal. He crossed to it and started stabbing his fingers at the glass screen, hunting desperately for a call button or keypad. He found a small silver intercom button and mashed it down, shoving his face so close to the speaker, his breath fogged the metal. He roared into it, demanding that Gerald open the gate this instant. He screamed that they knew he was in there playing games with the bank accounts. Brett threatened that if the gate wasn't opened immediately, he would call the police and have the old man hauled out of the house for elder endangerment. Caleb finally shoved his driver's door open and stormed up beside his brother-in-law. He was practically shaking, pointing a trembling finger directly at the lens of the main surveillance camera overhead. He shouted at the camera that this wasn't funny anymore. He screamed that his payroll had just bounced and demanded to know if his father had any idea what he had just done to his company. Caleb demanded the gate be opened and the new routing numbers handed over right now. He yelled that his father needed to stop throwing a childish fit just because they missed one stupid birthday dinner. They stood there side by side, two grown men in full meltdown on the wrong side of a fortified wall, waiting for the frail old man they had so carelessly written off to answer their demands. But the voice that finally broke the silence wasn't their father's. It didn't come from the intercom at all. It came from the dense tree line just to the right of the concrete pillars. A heavy reinforced door built seamlessly into the surrounding landscaping swung open and revealed a discreet climate-controlled guardhouse that had been completely invisible from the road. A man stepped out into the morning sun. He was not a neighborhood watch volunteer or a friendly local patrolman. He was a highly trained operative from an elite private security firm. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a spotless tactical black uniform bearing absolutely no company markings. A secure earpiece sat in his left ear, and a heavy utility belt wrapped his waist. His posture was rigid, and his expression gave nothing away. He looked like a man who was paid a very premium salary to remain completely unbothered by wealthy people losing their composure. In his right hand, he carried a plain black aluminum clipboard. The guard moved toward the iron gate with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just a few feet from where Caleb and Brett were standing. He did not look threatened. He did not look irritated. He regarded them with the cold, measuring gaze of a professional, assessing a minor disturbance at his perimeter. Brett immediately swung his fury at the new target. He jabbed a finger through the iron bars, barking that he had no idea who this guard was, or what kind of scheme he was running on his father-in-law. He ordered the gate opened, insisting they were family and had every legal right to be on the property. He threatened to have the guard arrested for trespassing and unlawful imprisonment if it stayed closed. The guard didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his radio. He calmly looked down at the clipboard, turning a single page with a slow, deliberate motion. He studied it for a moment before looking back up, meeting Brett's red-faced, furious glare with absolute chilling calm. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep even, and completely stripped of any customer service warmth, the voice of an immovable object. He informed them in a measured tone that he needed all of them to step away from the access terminal. He stated plainly that this was a private restricted estate, and that they were currently blocking the primary access road. Caleb seized the iron bars, his knuckles going white. His voice shifted fast from anger into a high, desperate pleading. He tried to explain that his father was inside, that his name was Gerald. Caleb frantically identified himself as the son and pointed toward Naomi, insisting she was the daughter. He begged the guard to just radio the house and tell Gerald his children were at the gate. He rambled that his father had made a simple mistake with the bank and would certainly tell the security team to let them through once he was reached. The guard lowered the clipboard slowly. He looked directly into Caleb's desperate, sweating face, unmoved entirely by the frantic explanation. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't ask for identification. He simply stood motionless on the other side of the iron barrier because he already knew exactly who they were. The guard held his position clipboard at his side. He didn't blink. He didn't offer a single trace of empathy or understanding. He simply stared at Caleb with eyes that had faced far worse than a panicked man in a wrinkled designer suit. Caleb's chest heaved as he waited for the guard to pick up the radio and call the main house. I expected the man to apologize for the confusion and punch in the code on the biometric scanner, but the guard did nothing of the sort. He simply planted his boots on the asphalt and looked at the two furious men standing on the wrong side of the iron bars. A fresh, far hotter wave of panic surged up in Caleb's throat. He grabbed the thick metal bars with both hands and shook them with whatever strength he still had. His voice cracked and split as he screamed into the cool morning air. "We are his children. Open the gate. We have every right to be here. My company is coming apart, and I need to talk to my father right now. Open the gate." The guard made no move toward the gate controls. He didn't reach for his radio. He raised his chin slightly, projecting his voice cleanly over the sound of the two idling luxury engines. His tone was smooth and left no room for negotiation. "Mr. Gerald has explicitly revoked your access to this property. You are trespassing on a private estate. I need you to return to your vehicles and turn them around immediately." The words settled over everything heavy and absolute. Brett took a step back, his mouth dropping open as the full weight of it landed on him. Tessa let out a loud, hysterical sob from the passenger seat of the silver sedan, pressing her face into her hands. She understood perfectly well what those words meant. The unending flow of money was finished. The bank accounts weren't frozen because of some technical glitch or a phishing scam. They were locked because the man they had treated like a personal ATM had finally decided to close the account. Naomi couldn't absorb the rejection. The scorching humiliation she'd endured at the country club was still raw and burning. Her friends had whispered about the declined card. The club manager had looked at her with a veneer of polite disgust. She had driven all the way up this road, fully intending to scream at her father for embarrassing her. The notion that she was now being turned away by a hired employee was simply intolerable. Naomi shoved the door of her white utility vehicle open and marched toward the iron gate high heels, striking the pavement with sharp, aggressive clicks. Her face was twisted with blind fury and sheer disbelief. She shouldered past her husband and her brother, throwing her full body weight into the iron bars. She screamed that she wasn't going anywhere until her father walked down that driveway and faced her himself. She jammed her arms through the gaps in the iron, straining toward the glowing biometric scanner on the steel pedestal. She flailed wildly, clawing at the air, her manicured nails raking against the cold metal casing. Naomi ordered the guard to step aside, swearing she would go over the fence if she had to. She screamed that she was the daughter of the man who owned this land, and no hired help was going to stand between her and what was rightfully hers. She was entirely out of control, a full physical meltdown, unfolding right there on the asphalt. The lead security guard didn't engage with any of it. He simply took one measured step backward, removing himself from her reach, and raised his left hand toward the hidden reinforced door in the tree line. A silent tactical signal. The heavy door opened immediately. Two more security guards emerged from the climate-controlled guardhouse. built like the first towering broad across the shoulders, dressed in identical unmarked black tactical uniforms. They moved with a quiet, synchronized efficiency that was genuinely unsettling. No shouting, no rushing. They simply marched forward and came to a stop directly behind the iron gate, positioning themselves shoulder to shoulder, a human wall of solid muscle and absolute authority. The sudden appearance of reinforcements broke whatever bravado the three of them still had. Naomi stopped screaming, her arms dropping limp at her sides as she stared at the three imposing figures. Caleb took a slow, shaking step backward, his hands sliding off the bars. Brett grabbed his wife by the arm and pulled her away from the gate. The physical weight of the situation was crushing. This was not a lonely old man they could intimidate into giving in. This was a trained security detail that would not hesitate to act if they pushed any further. They were outmatched in every way. High above it all, settled comfortably in his private study, Gerald watched the entire scene play out on his high-definition security tablet. He leaned back in his leather chair, a warm mug of black coffee in his hand. The live feed was crystal clear. He could see the sweat running down Caleb's panicked face. He could see Naomi crying furiously into her hands as Brett dragged her from the gate. He could see the sheer terror in Tessa's eyes as she looked out from the passenger seat of the sedan. For 38 years, Gerald had cleaned up every mess they made. He had written the checks, he had paid off the debts. He had swallowed their disrespect and their arrogance because he believed that was what a devoted father was supposed to do. He had allowed them to walk over him out of some misguided sense of obligation. But watching the security feed now, he understood that he was finally completely free. Not a single ounce of guilt moved through him. Not one shred of pity. What he felt instead was a deep, overwhelming peace. The weight he had been carrying for decades had lifted from his shoulders at last. Gerald set his coffee mug carefully on the wooden coaster on his desk. He leaned forward and pressed his finger against the silver intercom button on the security console. The audio link connected directly to the speakers mounted on the concrete pillars outside the gate. He took a slow, deep breath, drawing on every measure of resolve and closure he had built. His voice, when it came, carried no anger and no vindictiveness. It was calm, steady, and charged with absolute finality. "You told me to stay on my own," Gerald said, his voice carrying clearly through the outdoor speakers. It rang out across the driveway and rolled down through the quiet valley below. Down at the gate, all four of them went rigid. Caleb snapped his head up, his eyes darting wildly to the surveillance cameras. Naomi stopped crying, staring in stunned silence. Brett and Tessa sat frozen in their vehicles. "I took your advice," Gerald continued, his voice smooth and unhurried, filling the space completely. "Goodbye." He released the intercom button and cut the connection. He didn't wait for their reactions. He had no interest in their desperate apologies or their screaming. He simply settled back in his chair and watched the silent video feed, knowing the matter was finally and fully closed. Down at the foot of the driveway, the three guards received their final instructions through their earpieces. The lead guard stepped forward and pointed a firm, deliberate finger at Caleb and Brett. He told them to return to their vehicles at once. He stated that the property owner had issued a final directive and that any further resistance would result in an immediate police response and formal trespassing charges. He ordered them to put their cars in reverse and back slowly down the road. Caleb stared up at the surveillance cameras for one long, agonizing moment. His chest rose and fell heavily as the full reality settled in. There would be no negotiation. There would be no bailout. The company he had constructed on his father's money would be finished by the end of the day. He turned away, shoulders caved, carrying the full weight of defeat, and walked slowly back to the silver sedan. He got in, dropped into the driver's seat, and ignored Tessa's frantic sobbing beside him. He wrapped his hands around the steering wheel and shifted into reverse. Brett pulled Naomi back to their white utility vehicle. She was still weeping, hands shaking as she climbed in. Brett slammed her door and jogged around to the driver's side. He didn't look back at the guards. He put the car in reverse and kept his eyes fixed on the rear view mirror. The three security guards didn't simply stand and watch them go. They moved forward in formation, stepping out from behind the heavy iron gate. They flanked both luxury vehicles, using hand signals to direct the slow, humiliating retreat. Caleb and Brett were made to inch their expensive cars backward down the long, winding driveway. The guards walked the length of it alongside them, ensuring there were no stops, no attempts to turn around on the private property. It was a slow, grinding march of total defeat. The gravel crunched beneath the tires. With every foot of ground, they surrendered the sound of a massive, spectacular failure echoing up the hillside. The guards stayed with both vehicles all the way to the base of the mountain road, physically walking them off the estate and out onto the public highway. Before we go any further, I need you to brace yourself for what's coming. What Gerald was about to discover would change the entire shape of this story, and the people he loved most would never see it coming. Tell me something. If you learned someone close to you had quietly been working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and build your case in silence? The moment the tires crossed the property line, the guards stopped. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the asphalt, watching as Caleb and Brett finally shifted their cars into drive. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle eased away, folding into the sparse morning traffic. They looked small and utterly without consequence as they vanished around the bend, heading back toward a life they could no longer afford. The guards turned and marched back up the hill, disappearing behind the solid black iron bars. The heavy gate held its ground, standing watch over the quiet, beautiful estate. Inside the main house, Gerald lifted his coffee mug and took a long, satisfying sip. The coffee was perfect. The house was absolutely still. And for the first time he could remember, that stillness felt completely magnificent. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle pulled into the cracked, empty asphalt of a deserted strip mall parking lot just 3 miles down the highway. The engines idled, ticking, as heat rose from the hoods. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The deep humiliation of being walked backward down a private driveway by hired muscle sat like a stone in the air of both vehicles. Caleb's hands stayed locked on the leather steering wheel, his chest heaving as the catastrophic truth of his situation finally burrowed all the way to the bone. His company was finished. Payroll had bounced. His phone was buried under furious messages from employees and vendors demanding money he simply didn't have. He shoved the car into park and flung the door open. He stepped out into the warm morning air and began pacing in tight, frantic lines across the faded parking lot, markings dragging both hands through his carefully styled hair until it stood out in wild, ragged spikes. A moment later, the doors of the utility vehicle banged open. Naomi stumbled out, her designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, doing nothing to hide the streaked mascara or the swollen redness around her eyes. Brett came around behind her, his face locked in a mask of deep purple fury. He was already on his phone, trying to negotiate an extension with the leasing company that was actively chasing down their vehicles. He ended the call and let out a string of curses, kicking a loose piece of gravel hard across the lot. Tessa climbed out of the passenger side of the silver sedan, and she wasn't crying. Tessa was a woman for whom social standing was the only currency that truly mattered. The discovery that her credit cards were frozen and her elite spa memberships were declining didn't bring her to tears. It filled her with something colder and far more lethal, a venomous, unforgiving fury. She shut the car door with enough force to rock the vehicle and walked straight at her husband. No comforting embrace. She drove a sharp, manicured finger into his chest, her voice soaked in contempt. She demanded to know how Caleb had managed to let a frail, retired old man completely unravel their entire lives in the course of a single morning. She swore she was not going back to her friends and confessing they were bankrupt because his father had thrown a childish fit. Caleb stared at her, eyes wide and desperate. He threw his hands up, pleading, asking what exactly she expected him to do against a solid iron wall and a team of private tactical security. He told her his father had cut them off entirely, the money was gone, and there wasn't a thing any of them could do about it. Tessa went still for a moment, eyes narrowing as her mind worked through the situation with cold surgical efficiency. The fury on her face quietly reshaped itself into something far more dangerous. Pure calculation. She lowered her hand and turned her gaze back toward the highway leading to the estate. Her voice fell to a calm, chilling whisper. She told Caleb they were looking at this the wrong way entirely. She said that normal, healthy, loving fathers don't simply wake up one morning, freeze their children's accounts, and post armed security at the end of the driveway. She turned slowly to face the group, eyes bright with a sudden dark clarity. She declared that Gerald had lost his mind. Brett stopped pacing and looked over at Tessa, the red slowly draining from his face as the idea took hold. A slow, calculating smile crept across his lips. He moved closer, his managerial instincts sliding smoothly into place. He agreed with Tessa completely. He pointed out that Gerald had been grieving alone in that enormous empty house for 5 years since Loretta passed. Brett suggested the isolation and the grief had finally fractured the old man's judgment. He stated with confidence that installing high-tech biometric gates and iron security barriers was not the behavior of a rational parent. It was a textbook case of severe, unchecked paranoia. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, eyes moving nervously between her husband and her sister-in-law. She asked what they were actually supposed to do about any of it, still raw from being turned out onto the street. Tessa moved closer to Naomi and placed a carefully soft, entirely insincere hand on her shoulder. She told Naomi that they weren't about to stand by and let their beloved father spiral through a mental breakdown alone. She said Gerald was clearly a danger to himself and his finances, and that someone was obviously pulling his strings. Tessa's eyes went wide as the perfect scapegoat snapped into focus. She announced it, Clifford. She claimed the slick, overpriced attorney had poisoned the mind of a sick, senile old man, manipulating Gerald into locking out his own family so Clifford could quietly bleed the estate trust dry for himself. The twisted, wholly invented story consumed them all instantly. It was precisely what they needed. It scrubbed away their guilt, buried their financial recklessness, and recast them as devoted, wronged children, racing to rescue their vulnerable father from a predatory lawyer. Caleb straightened up, something swelling in his chest as he seized on the lie with pitiful, desperate relief. He declared that Tessa was an absolute genius. He said they were going to take the estate back and freeze Clifford entirely out of the picture. Brett pulled his phone out again this time, not to beg a creditor. He told the group he knew a hard-charging litigation attorney in Richmond who specialized in aggressive estate law and hostile family takeovers. He dialed right there in the parking lot, pacing as he laid out their completely fabricated story in a smooth, practiced pitch to the lawyer on the other end of the line. He told the attorney that his father-in-law was exhibiting signs of advanced undiagnosed dementia, erratic, deeply paranoid behavior, and was currently being financially isolated and exploited by his longtime counsel. The plan was in motion with frightening speed. By mid-afternoon, the four of them were seated in a sleek downtown law office, signing their names across a mountain of legal declarations. They swore under penalty of perjury that Gerald was a danger to himself. They constructed a heartbreaking, entirely fictional portrait of an old man losing his grip on reality-building walls to shut out the family that loved him most. They filed an aggressive emergency petition for full legal conservatorship. They demanded the court hand them immediate unilateral control over the entire estate, all banking accounts, and the authority to remove Clifford from every legal role he held. They walked out of the downtown courthouse that afternoon, feeling powerful, fully convinced they had just outmaneuvered the master architect. They had set the hook completely blind to the fact that they were swimming straight into the final, devastating trap. The late afternoon sun dropped below the tree line, throwing long bands of amber light across the hardwood floors of the study. Gerald sat at his vintage drafting table, a piece of furniture he hadn't touched seriously since retirement. He rolled a smooth graphite pencil slowly between his fingers, looking down at a blank sheet of drafting paper. For decades, this table was where problems were solved. When a load-bearing wall wasn't holding, he calculated what it needed. When a foundation showed signs of settling, he engineered a way to stabilize the ground beneath it. I was a man who spent his career correcting structural failures, but staring at the empty white paper now, he understood that some structures simply couldn't be saved. Some things had to come all the way down, so the ground could be cleared and something new could rise in their place. The deep quiet of the fortified estate was broken by the sharp, sudden ring of the phone on his desk. Gerald didn't flinch. He didn't move quickly. He set the graphite pencil down, with care aligning it precisely parallel to the edge of the drafting board. He crossed to the heavy oak desk and picked up the phone. One name on the caller ID, Clifford. Gerald swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He didn't say hello. He simply waited, knowing precisely why the attorney was calling at this hour. "They took the bait, Gerald," Clifford said, his voice coming through the line with crisp, unmistakable clarity. The lawyer sounded entirely professional, but underneath the polished surface there was an unmistakable note of grim satisfaction. They just filed an emergency petition for full legal conservatorship at the downtown courthouse. The ink on the paperwork is barely dry. Gerald stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the iron gates holding their position at the foot of his driveway. A slow, grim smile moved across his weathered face. not a smile of joy or triumph. It was the expression of a man who had mapped out a devastating storm in advance and was now watching the first rain begin to fall. "Read it to me, Clifford," Gerald said, his voice steady and entirely unsurprised. "Tell me exactly what my children swore under penalty of perjury." He heard the rustle of heavy paper on the other end of the line. Clifford cleared his throat and prepared to recite the fabrication his children had formally placed before a judge. "They claim you are suffering from severe undiagnosed dementias, Gerald. They stated under oath that you have been displaying highly erratic and dangerously paranoid behavior over the last 48 hours. They specifically pointed to the installation of the security gates and the freezing of your assets as evidence that you have completely lost your grip on reality." Gerald let out a quiet, dry chuckle. A remarkably convenient story. In their minds, holding them financially accountable was apparently a clear symptom of degenerative brain disease. "It gets better." Clifford continued, his tone soaked in professional disdain. "They didn't stop at your mental capacity. They came after me directly. They formally accused me of elder abuse and financial manipulation. They told the court that I am taking advantage of a grieving, lonely old man, poisoning your mind against your loving family, so I can slowly drain the estate trust for my own gain. They are petitioning for my immediate removal as your legal counsel and demanding unilateral control over every asset you own." Gerald turned from the window and moved back toward his desk. The sheer audacity of the lies was breathtaking, and yet it was exactly what he and Clifford had anticipated. They had cornered his children financially, and rather than sitting with their own failures, the children had chosen the most aggressive, fraudulent path available. They were trying to use the court as a weapon to pick up the keys to the castle. "Are they requesting an emergency hearing?" Gerald asked, settling against the edge of the heavy oak desk. "Yes," Clifford answered without hesitation. "Because they claimed you posed a direct threat to your own financial well-being and cited my supposed manipulation, the judge granted an expedited hearing. We are scheduled to appear in court Monday morning. They are going to stand before a judge and attempt to strip away your basic human rights so they can cover their luxury cars and failing businesses." Gerald looked down at his hands, the hands of a builder, rough, calloused, and completely steady. These hands had fed those children, clothed them, constructed the very roof they grew up beneath. And now, those same children were trying to legally bind those hands so they could go through his pockets. Whatever grief he had carried through the last few days burned away, entirely replaced by a cold, calibrated resolve. The final remnant of parental guilt disappeared, leaving only the precise readiness of an architect prepared to execute a controlled demolition. "Clifford," Gerald said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "We handed them the rope, and they went ahead and fashioned the noose themselves. I want you to prepare the final set of documents." "You mean the medical files?" Clifford asked, confirming the plan. "I mean everything Gerald said. Have the chief of neurology forward the certified results of my cognitive exams from last month. Have the psychiatric evaluation clearly highlighted, showing that I rank in the top percentile for mental acuity for my age group. I want those medical records bound and ready to hand to the judge the absolute second they finish telling their lies." "Consider it done, Gerald. The medical defense will be completely bulletproof. But what about the other matter?" Clifford paused, the weight of what was coming hanging heavily on the line. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the commercial trust transfer? Once I file these deeds, there is no going back. The estate and the surrounding land will be legally untouchable." Gerald looked out the window one final time, his gaze moving across the vast, rolling 50 acres of prime real estate he had quietly held for decades. He looked at the empty fields where he was about to build something that would actually mean something. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Clifford." Gerald replied, his tone absolute and immovable. "Draft the transfer deeds. Move the 15-acre estate and the 50 commercial acres directly into the new architectural trust. Liquidate my personal ownership entirely. When my children walk into that courtroom on Monday expecting to seize an empire, I want you to be fully prepared to show them that the empire no longer exists." "Understood, Gerald." Clifford's voice carried a rare flicker of admiration beneath its usual businesslike tone. "I will have the final documents ready for your signature by tomorrow afternoon. Enjoy your weekend. It is going to be a very interesting Monday." Gerald ended the call and set the phone back on the desk. He walked to the drafting table and picked up his graphite pencil. He didn't feel tired. He didn't feel old. He felt a surge of deep, revitalizing energy course through him. He set the tip of the pencil against the blank paper and drew the first sharp, unyielding line of his brand new foundation. Monday morning arrived beneath a gray, low-hanging sky over Richmond, but the weather did nothing at all to dim the bright, triumphant energy of the four people striding up the wide concrete steps of the downtown courthouse. Caleb, Naomi, Tessa, and Brett moved together in a tight, arrogant formation. They did not look like a family weighed down by the tragic decline of a beloved father. They looked like an executive board arriving to celebrate a lucrative acquisition. Every detail of their appearance had been carefully curated to project quiet, tasteful wealth and deep respectability. Caleb wore a bespoke navy suit that ran well over $3,000, purchased entirely on the monthly allowance he had just lost. Tessa walked at his side, wrapped in immaculate high-end fabric, her designer handbag gripped firmly in her manicured hands. Naomi and Brett looked equally polished, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable confidence. They were utterly convinced they had already won. In the echoing marble corridor just outside the probate courtroom, they gathered in a tight circle for one final run-through of their performance. Tessa leaned in, close voice dropping to a hushed conspiratorial whisper, reminding Caleb to soften his tone when speaking to the judge. She told him to look heartbroken and reluctant, rather than eager or triumphant. Naomi rehearsed her role with practiced ease, drawing a folded tissue from her purse and pressing it lightly to the corners of her completely dry eyes. They were treating the systematic dismantling of their father's independence as nothing more than a small theatrical production. They traded rapid, excited whispers about what came next, mapping out in precise detail what they would do the moment the judge placed the legal keys to the 15-acre estate in their hands. Caleb muttered that he would have the banking portals unlocked by noon, pushing his bounced payroll through before his employees walked out. Naomi whispered that she would personally oversee the sale of the property, while Brett assured the group that Clifford would be legally barred from the premises before lunch. The bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors and called the courtroom to order. All four of them walked down the center aisle and took their seats at the petitioner's table, moving with a quiet, practiced solemnity. The courtroom was vast and still heavy with the smell of old wood and floor wax. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man, with decades on the bench, sat elevated above them, working through the thick stack of emergency filings. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. His face dropped immediately into a mask of profound, manufactured sorrow. He shook his head slowly, murmuring to his expensive litigation attorney, playing the part of the devastated son who had been forced by tragic circumstance to take drastic legal action against his own father. Naomi slipped into the performance seamlessly beside him. She let out a soft, audible sniffle and pressed the tissue to her nose. She wanted the judge to glance down from the bench and see exactly how deeply all of this was breaking her heart. Brett sat stoically beside her, draping a heavy, reassuring arm across her shoulders, projecting the flawless image of a supportive, deeply concerned son-in-law. They were entirely convinced their fabricated paperwork and their emotional performance were bulletproof. They believed the false narrative they had constructed about a frail, paranoid, dementia-riddled old man was the only version of reality that would matter inside this room. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, resonant thud. The sound cut instantly through the quiet murmur of the proceedings, pulling every head in the room around. Caleb, Naomi, Tessa, and Brett shifted in their seats, craning their necks to look back. They fully expected a frail, disoriented old man to come shuffling down the aisle, wheeled in perhaps, or guided carefully by a court-appointed health advocate. They expected to see the broken, paranoid victim they had so vividly described in their fraudulent petition. Instead, Gerald walked through the doors. The air in the room seemed to move, drawn toward the commanding presence crossing the threshold. He was not shuffling. He was not confused. He moved with the rigid, perfectly balanced bearing of a master architect who understood precisely how to inhabit a room. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, broad shoulders filling it without effort, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie knotted sharply at his collar. His silver hair was combed cleanly back. His jaw was set and his eyes burned with an intense, unwavering clarity. He looked sharper, stronger, and more overwhelmingly lucid than he had in more than a decade. The fragile, dementia-riddled ghost they had conjured in their sworn legal filings simply did not exist. Gerald paused for the briefest moment at the top of the center aisle, locking his gaze directly on his son and his daughter. He didn't look angry or afraid. He looked at them the way a judge looks at a defendant after the verdict has already been reached. Walking in perfect lockstep right beside him was Clifford. The veteran attorney moved like a predator who had already scented blood. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit and carried an expression of supreme predatory confidence. In his right hand, Clifford held a massive thick leather briefcase. The bag looked heavy, its seams straining with the weight of meticulously prepared, devastating truth. That briefcase held no emotional appeals or family defenses. It contained the undeniable documented proof of multiple felonies. As Gerald and Clifford strode purposefully down the center aisle toward the defense table, the smug expressions on the faces of the children faltered just for a moment, just long enough to reveal the fear underneath. The polished surface of their performance began to show its cracks. Caleb felt a cold bead of sweat form at the base of his neck and slide slowly down his spine. Naomi lowered her tissue, her manufactured tears evaporating instantly as she stared in open-mouthed shock at the towering, immovable figure of her father. He did not look like a man who needed someone to manage his affairs. He looked exactly like a man preparing to execute a precise, merciless demolition of theirs. The heavy courtroom doors settled back into stillness as the judge called the first witness to the stand. Caleb rose from the petitioner's table, adjusting his cuffs. He walked toward the witness box with a measured, deliberate pace, doing his best to project the image of a reluctant, heartbroken son. He placed his right hand on the holy book, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. He looked up at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes, carefully concealing the desperate financial panic, screaming just beneath the surface of his tailored exterior. His litigation attorney guided Caleb gently through the rehearsed testimony. Caleb spoke in a soft, carefully modulated voice. He told the judge that his father Gerald had been suffering from deep isolation since the tragic passing of his mother Loretta 5 years ago. Caleb claimed that over the past 48 hours, that quiet grief had suddenly and violently erupted into severe paranoid delusions. He described driving up to his childhood home, only to find it barricaded behind massive newly installed iron gates. He painted a frightening picture of his father deploying a private tactical security force to physically remove his own loving family from the property. Caleb leaned forward, gripping the edges of the witness stand to underscore his fabricated distress. He testified that his father had completely lost his hold on reality. He stated that Gerald had erratically frozen every family bank account without warning or reason. Caleb told the judge his father was clearly suffering from advanced cognitive decline, no longer capable of understanding basic technology or managing his own substantial estate. He then shifted his gaze toward Clifford, casting the veteran attorney as a malicious predator who was actively exploiting a sick, confused old man for personal financial gain. Caleb finished his direct testimony by dropping his head, wearing the look of a man utterly devastated by his father's tragic mental deterioration. The courtroom sat in heavy silence for a long moment. Then Clifford rose slowly from the defense table. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He walked to the center of the room, carrying a single slim manila folder. He looked at Caleb with the cold, precise focus of a surgeon gripping a scalpel. Clifford began his cross-examination in a quiet, almost conversational register. He asked Caleb to clarify a specific point about the frozen bank accounts. He asked whether the locked accounts were Caleb's personal corporate accounts or private trust accounts solely owned and funded by Gerald. Caleb shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat, working to hold his composure. He answered that they were joint family accounts used for estate management. Clifford didn't let the evasion stand. He opened the folder and read from a bank statement. He asked Caleb to confirm that exactly $12,000 had been transferred from Gerald to Caleb and his sister every single month for the past 3 years. Caleb swallowed hard, a bead of sweat now visible at his temple. He stammered that his father had simply been helping with general family expenses. Clifford took a step closer to the witness box. His voice climbed slightly, filling the marble walls. He asked Caleb whether it was true that, without his father's monthly support, Caleb's technology consulting firm had completely missed payroll the previous Friday morning. Caleb flushed a deep, blotchy red. His litigation attorney shot to his feet with an objection relevance, but the judge overruled it, leaning forward with sudden focused attention. Caleb was forced to answer. He muttered a barely audible confirmation. Clifford smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. He asked Caleb whether it was possible that his father wasn't suffering from paranoid delusions at all. Clifford suggested that perhaps Gerald had simply recognized his son as a 38-year-old man running a bankrupt company and made the decision to permanently close the account. Caleb's grip on the witness railing tightened, his knuckles going white as his carefully built narrative dissolved under oath. He tried to push back, but Clifford simply thanked him and dismissed him from the stand, leaving Caleb fully exposed and humiliated before the judge. Naomi was called next. She practically drifted to the witness box, her face a masterwork of theatrical suffering. She clutched a fresh white tissue in trembling hands, settling into the chair with a dramatic, helpless sigh. The moment her attorney began asking questions, Naomi dissolved into soft, practiced tears. She cried that she just wanted her father to be safe. She wove a vivid emotional story about arriving at the estate to check on his deteriorating health, only to be confronted by armed guards. She claimed her father was a prisoner in his own home, frightened and bewildered by the modern world. She looked directly at the judge, her voice breaking with perfect timing. She begged the court to grant them the conservatorship so she could rescue her father from his own failing mind. She insisted the frozen accounts proved he could no longer manage his finances or his daily life on his own. She presented herself as the ultimate devoted daughter, willing to shoulder the enormous burden of overseeing the sprawling estate entirely out of unconditional love. Clifford approached the witness stand for his second cross-examination. He offered Naomi no gentle pleasantries. He went straight to her country club membership. Naomi blinked, her false tears halting abruptly as pure confusion spread across her face. She asked what her social club had to do with her father's failing health. Clifford informed the court that Naomi and her husband Brett were currently carrying over $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt. He read aloud from a financial disclosure, showing that her luxury utility vehicle was 3 months behind on lease payments and had been flagged for repossession on the exact same morning she claimed she had driven out to check on her father. Naomi opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The polished, composed image she had carefully constructed just moments before shattered completely. Clifford did not let up. He asked Naomi whether she had driven out to the estate that Friday morning out of genuine concern for her father's state of mind, or because her platinum card had just been declined in front of her wealthy circle of friends. He asked whether she wanted the conservatorship to protect Gerald, or whether she urgently needed the legal authority to liquidate his assets before her own creditors finished dismantling her life. Naomi went bright red, her voice climbing into a shrill defensive pitch. She shouted that Clifford was distorting the facts and manipulating the court. She screamed that she was entitled to that money, she was the daughter, and her father owed them a certain standard of living. The sudden explosive outburst rang through the hushed courtroom. She had dropped the grieving daughter act entirely, and what surfaced beneath it was vicious, entitled greed. The judge looked down at Naomi with an expression of undisguised, profound disgust. The portrait of a frail, paranoid old man had been taken apart piece by piece. Clifford had masterfully revealed the children for what they actually were: not devoted caretakers, but bankrupt adults attempting to legally plunder the man who had financed their entire lives. Gerald sat quietly at the defense table, watching his children writhe under the crushing weight of their own exposed deceptions. The trap had been executed flawlessly, and the final devastating blow was still waiting inside Clifford's heavy leather briefcase. A low, restless energy still moved through the courtroom in the wake of Naomi's outburst. The judge struck his wooden gavel sharply against the sounding block, demanding complete silence. He fixed a hard stare on the petitioner table, where all four sat utterly frozen. Their carefully polished performance lay in ruins. Clifford stood at the center of the room, perfectly composed, absorbing the palpable fear radiating from the children. He addressed the judge in a smooth, resonant voice, advising the court that the defense was prepared to present its primary evidence. Clifford moved back to the heavy leather briefcase on the defense table. He snapped the brass latches open, the crisp metallic click cutting through the quiet room. He reached inside and withdrew a clean white folder. He carried it to the bench and placed the documents before the judge. Clifford explained that the court had been presented with a harrowing fictional account of a man in the grip of severe cognitive decline. To address this fabrication directly, Clifford submitted comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluations completed just 48 hours prior by the chief of neurology at the state medical board. He paced slowly before the witness stand, projecting his voice so that every person seated in the gallery could hear each word with clarity. He walked through the medical findings with surgical precision, The reports confirmed that Gerald was not only entirely free of any degenerative brain disease, but had scored in the 99th percentile for mental acuity, spatial reasoning, and cognitive processing within his age group. The presiding psychiatrist had formally noted that Gerald was remarkably lucid and sharp, possessing an extraordinary capacity for complex problem solving. He was not a fragile paranoid victim. He was a highly functional master architect, operating at the absolute peak of his mental faculties. The judge spent several long minutes working through the certified medical documents, adjusting his glasses and turning from page to page, his expression growing darker with every paragraph he read. The legal threshold for a conservatorship demanded undeniable proof of mental incompetence. The medical file in his hands proved the exact opposite. He looked down at Caleb and Naomi, his eyes narrowing with fierce judicial anger. He informed their litigation attorney bluntly that the medical evidence flatly contradicted their sworn emergency petition. Caleb sank lower in his chair, the walls of the courtroom seeming to press inward around him. Tessa gripped his forearm, her fingernails biting painfully into the fabric of his expensive tailored suit. They had built everything on the assumption that a judge would simply look at an old man and accept the worst. They had never anticipated that Gerald would move proactively to secure airtight medical defense records, but the demolition of their false narrative was only the opening act. Clifford had simply cleared the brush away. Now he was preparing to detonate the foundation. He returned to his briefcase and produced a second folder, considerably thicker than the first. This one was bound in a thick burgundy folder. He walked back to the center of the courtroom, holding it up so the children could see it plainly. He addressed the judge, his voice dropping to a low, unsettling register. He stated that the court had just witnessed a desperate attempt to strip a perfectly healthy man of his fundamental human rights. Clifford put a simple, pointed question to the judge. Why would 4 wealthy, successful young adults commit perjury to seize control of an estate they were already destined to inherit? He did not wait for opposing counsel to object. He furnished the answer immediately. He declared that this petition for conservatorship had nothing whatsoever to do with medical care, isolation, or a father shutting his children out. He stated with booming absolute clarity that the children had filed this emergency petition for a single reason. They were desperately trying to cover their tracks after committing massive felony wire fraud against their own father. The word fraud settled over the courtroom, like something with physical mass. Naomi gasped audibly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Caleb turned the color of ash. Brett physically shoved his chair back from the table, as though trying to put distance between himself and the explosion already underway. Their high-priced litigation attorney looked completely blindsided, leaning in frantically and whispering to Caleb, demanding to know what Clifford was talking about. Caleb could not produce a response. His throat had gone completely dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs so violently he thought it might crack his chest open. Clifford approached the bench and handed the thick burgundy folder to the judge. He then turned to face the gallery and began methodically dismantling the entire timeline of events. He explained that 3 days ago, on the evening of Gerald's 71st birthday, Gerald had logged into his secure private banking portal. Clifford told the court that Gerald did not find a confusing technological interface. He found a deeply suspicious critical security alert concerning the deed to his 15-acre estate. Clifford walked the judge through the documents line by agonizing line. He revealed the commercial bridge loan application, a formal request to borrow $500,000 using the entire unencumbered estate as absolute collateral. The funds were directed to be immediately dispersed into an offshore holding account, managed jointly by Caleb and Naomi. Clifford directed the court's attention to the final page of the application, highlighting the digital signatures. He explained that the children had deliberately bypassed their father's primary email address, rerouted the secure verification codes, and forged his digital signature with chilling precision. The judge turned to the back of the file, his face deepening to a mottled red. He was an officer of the law, and he despised being used as a pawn in a criminal scheme. He studied the digital logs Clifford had carefully provided. Clifford announced that the Cybersecurity Division had traced the Internet Protocol addresses attached to the fraudulent loan submission. The digital footprint did not lead back to the estate in the Virginia countryside. It led directly to the primary server inside Caleb's corporate office in Richmond. The timestamps established that the application had been submitted, while Gerald was sitting alone at his dining room table, waiting for his children to arrive for his birthday dinner. The revelation was absolutely devastating. Clifford drew the entire chaotic narrative together into one tight, horrifying package. He looked directly at the children and laid out their true motive for the court. He stated that Gerald did not freeze their accounts and erect a security gate because he was paranoid. Gerald built that gate because he caught them attempting to steal the very roof over his head. The children had not filed for conservatorship because they loved him. They filed the emergency petition because the bank fraud division had flagged the forged loan, and they needed unilateral legal control over the estate to force the paperwork through before federal authorities could be notified. They needed to have their father declared legally incompetent so they could seize the deed, execute the final authorizations themselves, and bury their federal crimes beneath the cover of estate management. They were attempting to use the gavel of this very court to complete a $500,000 theft. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Every molecule of air seemed to have been pulled from the room. Caleb dropped his face into his hands, understanding with perfect crystalline clarity that he would not be returning to his luxury apartment today. He was looking at federal prison. Naomi sat quietly, hyperventilating her pristine socialite image, completely obliterated. Brett and Tessa pushed their chairs away from the table, physically distancing themselves from the two siblings, fighting desperately to detach from the sinking vessel beside them. The judge slowly closed the burgundy folder. The flat slap of the cover hitting the bench echoed like a gunshot. He looked down at the petitioner table with a gaze so loaded with judicial fury that it made the litigation attorney physically flinch. The elaborate facade of the caring, prosperous children had been stripped entirely away. They stood fully exposed, not as concerned family members, but as ruthless, desperate criminals caught completely red-handed. Gerald remained at the defense table perfectly calm, perfectly still, watching the complete unraveling of the entitled monsters he had inadvertently brought into the world. The foundation beneath their arrogant lives had just been reduced to rubble, and there was nothing left standing. The silence that followed stretched across the courtroom for an agonizing span of time, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on everyone present. The judge sat high on his elevated bench, staring down at the thick burgundy folder that contained the irrefutable proof of my children's absolute treachery. When he finally looked up, his face carried an expression of pure, unfiltered judicial disgust. He removed his reading glasses and folded them slowly, deliberately, setting them beside his wooden gavel. He did not turn to Caleb or Naomi first. He fixed his furious gaze directly on their highly paid litigation attorney. The judge leaned forward, his voice rolling through the vast marble chamber with the weight of a thunderclap. He asked the attorney in a dangerously quiet tone whether it was his habit to use this court to facilitate $500,000 federal fraud schemes. Whatever slick corporate composure the attorney had managed to hold onto evaporated on the spot. He lurched to his feet so abruptly his heavy wooden chair scraped across the polished floor. He threw his hands up, shaking his head and stammering that he'd had absolutely no prior knowledge of any forged loan documents. Frantically, the lawyer began sweeping his pristine legal pads and expensive pens into his briefcase, physically retreating from the petitioner table. He practically shouted that his clients had deceived him, and he formally requested immediate withdrawal as their legal counsel. The judge granted it with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. The attorney turned on his heel and nearly sprinted down the center aisle, leaving Caleb and Naomi entirely abandoned to face what they had done. With the lawyer gone, the judge brought the full force of his contempt down upon my children. He leaned over the polished cherry wood bench, his voice heavy with profound disdain. He stated that in his 30 years presiding over probate and estate law, he had watched families tear one another apart over money, but he had rarely encountered something as fundamentally despicable as this. He told Caleb and Naomi that they had not only attempted to rob their own father of his home and his financial security, but had shamelessly tried to strip away his human dignity at the same time. They had come into his courtroom and weaponized the legal system itself, seeking to have a perfectly healthy, lucid man declared incompetent solely to bury a massive financial crime. Caleb sat completely paralyzed. He stared blankly at the judge, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The polished, successful entrepreneur he had appeared to be had dissolved entirely, leaving only a terrified, bankrupt man staring down the barrel of a ruined life. Naomi was no longer performing theatrical tears for the gallery's sympathy. She was sobbing violently from a place of sheer, unfiltered terror. Her hands trembled without stopping, as she understood that her country club circle and elite social world would soon be reading about her attempted felony fraud. Brett and Tessa sat rigidly beside them, their faces drained of every trace of color. They had entered the courthouse expecting a coronation, and were now coming to terms with the reality that they were bound to two people staring down serious criminal exposure. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He announced that the emergency petition for conservatorship was being dismissed with extreme prejudice. He stated clearly for the official court record that I was entirely competent to manage my own affairs and that the petitioners had acted with malicious, fraudulent intent. But the judge was not through. He pointed the heavy handle of his gavel directly at Caleb. He warned my son that the Federal Bank Fraud Division treated forged commercial bridge loans with exceptional seriousness. The judge stated plainly that Caleb and Naomi were extraordinarily fortunate that Clifford had not yet forwarded the digital footprint and the forged documents to the federal prosecutor. He promised them that if they ever attempted to file another petition in his courthouse, he would personally see to their criminal indictment. He slammed the gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp crack of it signaled the absolute permanent end of their legal scheming. The courtroom held its stillness even after the ruling landed. Nobody moved. The gallery sat watching the four thoroughly humiliated figures at the petitioner table. The magnitude of their defeat was total. They had nothing left at all. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their credit lines were exhausted. Their legal counsel had walked out the door. Their reputations lay in ruins. They had entered the room, reaching for an empire, and they were leaving with nothing beyond the clothes on their backs and the terrifying shadow of a looming federal investigation. I sat at the defense table and felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace settle over me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the sobbing woman or the trembling man across the aisle. Loretta had been right all along. My entire life I had shielded them from the hard reality of consequences, and they had answered that by trying to destroy me. Now at last, they were bearing the full crushing weight of their own choices. I had built the wall they needed to collide with, and they had hit it at full speed. I placed both hands flat on the cherry wood table and rose slowly to my feet. I buttoned my tailored suit jacket with careful, deliberate movements. The sound drew every eye in the room. Caleb lifted his head slowly, meeting my gaze through bloodshot, terrified eyes. Naomi let out a soft, pathetic whimper and shrank back into her chair. They looked at me the way cornered animals look at something they cannot escape. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to shout to command the room. I looked at my children and projected my voice just enough to cut through their quiet sobbing. I told them that the judge had spared them a prison cell today, but that our business was far from finished. I looked at Brett and Tessa, making certain they understood they bore equal responsibility for this betrayal. I told all four of them to gather their things and get up. I instructed them to walk down the center aisle and step outside onto the courthouse steps. I told them I had one final statement to make, and that they were going to stand there and hear every word of it. I turned away from their terrified faces and started for the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Clifford fell in beside me, carrying his massive leather briefcase. I did not glance back to confirm they were following. I knew they would. They had no other option. They were broken, stripped of every advantage they had counted on, and desperately anxious to learn whether I intended to hand them over to federal prosecutors. They were going to trail me out into the gray, overcast morning, and I was going to deliver the final decisive piece of my architectural masterpiece. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, sealing the stifling tension of the courtroom inside. We moved out into the vast, echoing marble corridor of the courthouse. The cool air of the hallway touched my face, yet I felt remarkably warm and composed. I walked slowly and deliberately, listening to the frantic, scrambling footsteps echoing at my back. Caleb and Naomi were nearly stumbling over each other, trying to close the distance. Every trace of their polished corporate arrogance had been scraped clean by the judge's ruling, leaving nothing in its place but raw, desperate need. Caleb seized my arm, his grip unsteady and shaking. He begged me to stop, his voice fracturing in the cavernous hallway. He swore he had never intended for things to reach this point, and pleaded that the forged commercial loan had only ever been meant as a temporary bridge. He pushed to convince me it was a desperate mistake made by a panicked man trying to salvage his failing tech company. He cried that he was staring down federal prison and complete total bankruptcy, begging his father to please call off the lawyers and undo the wreckage he had caused. Naomi pressed forward, tears running freely down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. This time, the tears were entirely real. She grabbed my other arm, sobbing that her social world was destroyed, that her luxury cars were actively being repossessed, and that she would do absolutely anything I asked if I simply restored her monthly allowance. She begged for a second chance, swearing she would be the devoted, caring daughter I had always wanted her to be. I stood perfectly still and looked at the two children I had raised. I felt nothing, no sympathy, no paternal warmth, nothing at all. Before I could even speak, the fragile alliance between the four of them shattered completely and without warning. Brett stepped forward, his face flushed with a furious, burning resentment. He jabbed a trembling finger at Caleb and Naomi, loudly declaring to everyone within earshot in that hallway that he had absolutely no involvement with the forged loan documents. He shouted that his wife and his brother-in-law were reckless, greedy fools who had dragged an innocent man into a massive federal crime. Tessa immediately threw herself into the screaming match. She turned on Caleb, demanding a divorce right there on the marble floor. She cried that she refused to remain legally tied to a bankrupt felon and watch her pristine social standing crumble because of his staggering incompetence. They stood in a circle, tearing viciously into one another like desperate animals fighting over the last scraps on the table. I watched their toxic spectacle for a long moment, taking in the full truth of who they were. The instant the free money vanished, they had turned on each other with savage hostility. I did not raise my voice. I simply cleared my throat, one sharp sound that cut through their shouting, and dropped instant silence over all of them. Every head swung toward me, their eyes wide with a desperate, clinging hope. They were still waiting for the master architect to arrive and rebuild the wreckage of their lives. I looked at Caleb and told him his apologies were entirely hollow and without meaning. I told Naomi that her tears were nothing more than the panic of a spoiled child losing her allowance. I explained calmly that they did not regret attempting to steal my home and my security. They regretted only getting caught. I told them I was not going to send them to federal prison because watching them survive inside the ruins of their own terrible financial decisions was a far more fitting and enduring punishment. Caleb exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He actually attempted a smile, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead and thanking me profusely. He assumed wrongly that avoiding a federal prison sentence meant the frozen bank accounts would somehow unlock themselves. He moved a step closer and told me we could return to the estate, sit down over a nice dinner, and work out a proper financial transition together. I shook my head slowly, and that final delusion collapsed. I told Caleb we were not going anywhere together. I glanced at Clifford, who stood quietly at my side, watching the wreckage with steady eyes. I gave him a slight nod. Clifford unlatched his heavy leather briefcase one last time. He reached inside and drew out a single neatly bound legal document printed on the thick premium paper. He placed it directly in Caleb's hands. Naomi, Brett, and Tessa immediately crowded in around him, their eyes racing frantically across the dense legal text. I watched the very last shreds of their hope dissolve as they read the first page. Caleb looked up at me, all color gone from his face. His jaw trembled as he asked what this document was, his voice dropping to a terrified, barely audible whisper. I spoke with absolute unwavering clarity, making sure every word landed with full, devastating weight. I told them they had spent their entire lives assuming they were the sole heirs to my 15-acre estate. What they never knew, because they had never once thought to ask about my life or my work, was that I also held the commercial zoning rights to the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I watched their eyes go wide with sheer unfiltered shock as the scale of what they had missed came into focus. They thought they were stealing a single custom-built house. They had entirely overlooked an empire sitting just behind it. I explained that, exactly 48 hours ago, while they were frantically working to forge my signature on a fraudulent bridge loan, I had been seated in my attorney's office executing a clean, airtight legal transfer. I told them the 15-acre estate, the custom-built house, and the surrounding 50 acres of commercial land no longer belonged to me personally. I had sold every single inch of it to a commercial trust that I control entirely. The inheritance they had fought so desperately to seize simply did not exist anymore. It was gone, liquidated, transferred, and moved permanently beyond their reach. Naomi's designer purse slipped from her fingers and struck the hard marble floor, the thud echoing down the corridor. She stared at me in complete disbelief, her voice unsteady as she asked what I intended to do with all the land and all that money. I smiled. It was the first genuine feeling of joy I had known in 5 long years. I told them I was finally correcting my greatest architectural mistake. I explained that the commercial trust was already funding the full demolition of the massive empty house they had tried to steal. In its place, I was building a state-of-the-art architectural academy for underprivileged youth, a sweeping modern campus where hard-working students could learn to design and raise real sturdy foundations. And across the surrounding 50 acres, I was developing a thoughtfully designed, affordable housing project for families who actually understood the meaning of hard work and gratitude. I told them I was not simply liquidating my assets to spite them. I was taking the wealth they had felt so violently entitled to and using it to build something that genuinely mattered. I was giving my fortune to complete strangers because those strangers possessed far more integrity, more drive, and more honor than my own flesh and blood. Caleb stared blankly at the legal document trembling in his hands. The full, suffocating enormity of what he had lost finally crushed him completely. He had traded a vast multi-million-dollar kingdom for a fraudulent $500,000 loan and had come away with absolutely nothing. Tessa let out a quiet, devastated sob, the reality of her permanently finished luxury life settling over her. Brett stood staring at the floor, hollowed out and entirely humiliated. I told them they had spent their whole lives treating me like a disposable source of funds. I told them they had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness and my bottomless generosity for stupidity. I looked at all 4 of them, standing in that cold corridor completely bankrupt, publicly exposed, legally stripped of every tool they had wielded. I told them they were finally entirely free to live the lives they had demanded on that birthday call. I advised them to learn how to budget, and quickly because the master architect had officially closed the bank and there would never be another deposit. The absolute terror in their eyes was no longer something I felt any pull to relieve. For 38 years I had positioned myself between them and every consequence they ever deserved. I had paid the debts. I had smoothed over the failures. I had let them believe that their arrogant, reckless behavior was simply the entitlement of their birthright. But standing there looking at Caleb and Naomi, stripped of their unearned wealth, staring into the stark and unforgiving reality of the world, I felt a profound, settled sense of finality. I took one step closer, making certain my voice was the only thing they could hold on to. I told Caleb that his failed companies and his bounced payrolls were no longer mine to subsidize. I told Naomi that her desperate need to impress wealthy strangers was a burden she would carry entirely on her own from this point forward. I looked straight into their wide, panicked eyes, watching the last remnants of their entitlement burn away. "You wanted your own lives," I said, my voice steady and carrying clearly down the marble corridor. "You have them. Your debts are yours. Your failures are yours. I am no longer your safety net." I did not wait for their responses. I had no desire to hear their desperate wailing or their hollow promises of change. I simply turned my back and walked away down the long, echoing corridor toward the main exit of the courthouse. Clifford fell into step right beside me, his heavy leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. I pushed through the massive brass doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps. The gray overcast sky had finally cracked open, and a cold, crisp wind moved through the streets of the downtown. I drew a deep breath of the freezing air and felt lighter than I had in decades. The enormous grinding weight of trying to rescue people who were actively working to destroy me had lifted completely. I descended the courthouse steps with the steady, balanced stride of a man who had finally set his own house in order. I could hear the frantic, heavy footsteps of my children crashing through the doors behind us, but I did not slow my pace, and I did not turn around. Out on those wide concrete steps, the desperate quiet was shattered by Tessa. The composed, polished socialite front she had maintained for years collapsed entirely, replaced by a shrill, panicked scream of pure terror. She grasped in that moment that the luxurious, effortless life she had married into was permanently finished. The offshore accounts were empty. The sprawling estate had passed into a commercial trust. The limitless stream of money was dead. She turned on Caleb, her face twisted with a vicious and unforgiving rage. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure who had pulled her down into a massive federal fraud investigation. She snatched her expensive designer handbag and hurled it directly at his chest, landing with a loud, dull thud. Caleb reached toward her, stammering and pleading for her to calm down, promising he could find a bankruptcy lawyer and work some kind of path out of the wreckage. Tessa knocked his hands aside, entirely disgusted by his weakness. She shouted that she was going home to pack her things and file for divorce before the federal authorities could freeze whatever meager personal assets she still had. She pivoted on her heel, the sharp click of her shoes against the concrete cutting through the cold air, and marched down the steps, leaving her husband completely behind. The contagion of betrayal spread instantly to Naomi and Brett. Brett ignored his collapsing marriage, entirely channeling all of his furious energy directly onto his wife. He jabbed a trembling finger at Naomi's face, his voice fracturing with sheer unfiltered panic. He screamed that her staggering incompetence had obliterated his entire life. He shouted that the leasing company was probably already towing their luxury vehicles out of the courthouse parking lot at that very moment. He reminded her that their country club friends were going to read every word of this humiliating public spectacle, and they would find themselves blacklisted from every elite social circle in the county. Naomi crumpled onto the hard, cold concrete steps, weeping with a raw, gut-wrenching despair. She begged Brett to stop shouting at her, clutching at his suit jacket, pleading with him to tell her how they were going to survive the weekend. Brett wrenched his jacket from her desperate grip, his face flushed dark with anger. He told her she was going to need to find a minimum wage job and work out how to pay down $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt entirely on her own. I reached the bottom of the long staircase where a sleek black SUV sat idling by the curb waiting for me and Clifford. The driver stepped out and respectfully opened the rear passenger door. Before I slid inside the warm, quiet interior, I paused. I turned and looked back up the broad flight of concrete steps one final time. It was a pathetic, tragic scene. The four adults who had swept into that courthouse radiating untouchable arrogance and manufactured wealth were now turning savagely on one another like cornered, starving animals. Caleb sat on the steps with his face buried in his hands, his business destroyed, his wife gone, and his freedom dangling by a thin legal thread. Naomi was sobbing on the dirty concrete, begging a furious, screaming Brett not to leave her to face the mountains of debt they had accumulated together. They were tearing each other apart in the cold gray morning, swallowed whole by the consequences of their own bottomless greed. The foundation they had built their lives upon had been constructed from nothing but lies and stolen money. Now that it had been pulverized completely, the entire structure was caving inward, burying them under the weight of their own terrible choices. They were finally meeting the real unforgiving world without a single dollar of my money standing between them and it. I watched them for a few more seconds, feeling entirely detached from their suffering. Then I turned, settled into the leather seat of the SUV, and told the driver to take us home. 6 months passed. The hard freeze of winter had slowly given way to a crisp, clear spring. But the turning seasons delivered no warmth whatsoever to the brutal reality my children were now forced to inhabit. Inside a cramped, windowless office building on the outskirts of Richmond, Caleb sat hunched over a cheap laminate desk. He was no longer wearing his $3,000 bespoke navy suits. Those had been sold off months earlier to cover a fraction of his crushing corporate debt. Instead, he wore a faded gray button-down with fraying edges at the collar. A heavy headset was clamped over his ears, tethering him to a small, isolated cubicle. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable tech visionary, pitching inflated startup ideas to wealthy investors in glass-walled boardrooms. He was an entry-level sales representative, cold-calling irritated customers to peddle discounted office supplies. He stared at the glowing spreadsheet on his monitor, his eyes bloodshot and hollow with deep physical exhaustion. The aggressive voice of his regional manager crackled over the intercom, demanding higher call volumes and threatening immediate termination for anyone who missed their daily quota. Caleb flinched at the sharp sound. For 38 years, he had answered to no one. He had never once feared losing his livelihood because his father had always been standing directly behind him with an open checkbook ready to catch him the moment he stumbled. Now there was no safety net. There was only the relentless grinding pressure of scraping together barely enough to cover his minimum monthly rent. He picked up his headset, drew a slow and unsteady breath, and dialed the next number on the list. His voice cracked as he pushed through his scripted sales pitch, swallowing his pride completely as the customer on the other end rudely disconnected. Caleb closed his eyes and pressed his face into his rough, calloused hands, absorbing the full, crushing weight of the real world for the very first time. He finally understood that building something genuine required actual sweat and not simply empty, arrogant promises. Miles away in a rundown neighborhood, Her former country club friends would not have driven through. Naomi was living out her own spectacular fall from grace. She sat alone at a scratched, unsteady kitchen table in a tiny one-bedroom apartment. The manicured lawns and heated pools she had taken entirely for granted were long gone, replaced by the grinding rumble of elevated train tracks just beyond her thin, rattling window. Brett was gone too. The moment the money evaporated and the high-interest debt collectors began circling their marriage had completely imploded. He had packed his things and walked out, leaving Naomi to absorb the devastating fallout of their lavish lifestyle entirely on her own. She stared down at a pile of past-due utility bills spread across the cheap table. A basic plastic pen trembled in her hand as she tried to work out how she was going to afford groceries for the rest of the week. Her luxury vehicle had been repossessed months earlier, seized from a public parking lot, while she stood watching in total humiliation. She now relied on a worn bus pass to make her way across town to a new job, working as a junior receptionist at a low-tier commercial real estate firm. The commute was long and draining, forcing her to stand in the freezing rain alongside the everyday working people she used to openly look down upon. The very women she had once dismissed at elite social gatherings were now the demanding clients she was obligated to serve coffee to. The humiliation burned in her chest every single day, but she had no alternative. She set her pen down carefully and looked around the cramped, dimly lit room, feeling the walls drawing in around her. The silence of that small apartment was suffocating and entirely unfamiliar. There were no lavish parties to attend, no expensive dinners to post about, and absolutely no father left to pull her back from the edge of her own poor decisions. Naomi finally understood the true value of $1 because for the very first time in her life, she was actually being forced to earn one. While my children were at last learning how to survive the harsh reality they had so aggressively demanded, I moved at an unhurried pace through the quiet, peaceful grounds of the cemetery. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine and cut grass. I held a simple, beautiful bouquet of white roses in my right hand, walking with a steady, balanced stride. I no longer felt the heavy, suffocating sorrow that used to shadow these visits. What I felt instead was a deep, unwavering sense of clarity and abiding peace. I reached the familiar marble headstone, resting in the shade of a great old oak tree. I knelt down gently and laid the white roses against the smooth, cool stone, tracing my fingertips across the beautifully carved letters of Loretta's name. I drew a slow breath, letting the stillness of the cemetery settle over me completely. I looked at the headstone and began to speak, my voice quiet, steady, and carrying the full weight of closure. I told her she had been right all along. I admitted that my endless generosity had been nothing more than a selfish desire to play the hero in their lives, all while ignoring the severe structural damage it was doing to who they were becoming. I told my beautiful, clear-eyed wife that I had finally corrected my greatest architectural mistake. I explained that a strong building cannot stand on a foundation of unearned privilege and endless rescue. It needs the heavy curing pressure of real consequences to solidify its core. I told her I had torn out the rotted foundation of their entitlement and forced them to rebuild their lives from the absolute ground up. I smiled, looking up at the morning sun, filtering through the green canopy overhead, casting warm gold light across the polished marble. I told Loretta that Caleb was finally learning the true worth of an honest day's work, and that Naomi was finally grasping what genuine independence actually costs. The demolition had been ugly, painful, and entirely without mercy, but it was the only way any real growth could take root. I rose from my knees, brushing the soft dirt away, feeling lighter and more grounded than I had in years. I had stopped trying to shield them from the world, and in doing so, I had finally given them the chance to actually live in it. The warm afternoon sun fell across the pine planks of my new back porch in a rich golden wash. I stood at the smooth wooden railing with a simple ceramic mug of black coffee in my hand. The vast, sprawling mansion that Loretta and I had built together so many years ago was completely gone. Something extraordinary was rising in its place. The deep rumble of diesel engines and the steady rhythm of steel hammers rang out across the valley. It was not the sound of destruction. It was the resonant living music of a new beginning. The Architectural Academy was climbing out of the earth, a brilliant skeleton of reinforced steel beams and wide glass panels catching the afternoon light. I watched the construction crews working steadily below, pouring the concrete foundations that would soon anchor classrooms, design studios, and workshops. This was no hollow monument to my ego, no bloated safety net for grown adults who refused to grow. It was a genuine legacy. Spread across the large wooden drafting table on my porch lay dozens of architectural blueprints, their edges lifting softly in the spring breeze. Around the table stood 5 young, eager students, nothing like the people who used to fill my home. These young men and women wore no expensive designer labels and drove no luxury vehicles. They came in faded jeans, scuffed work boots, and plain cotton shirts. They arrived from hard neighborhoods and difficult circumstances, carrying nothing but a fierce and undeniable hunger to build something better for themselves. A young man named Dario ran a calloused finger along the intricate lines of a structural diagram, putting a highly technical question to me about load-bearing distribution. I set my coffee mug on the railing and walked over to the table. I did not hand him the answer. I guided him carefully, pointing out the stress factors and the material constraints, then stepping back and asking him to solve the structural puzzle himself. I watched his brow draw tight in concentration before a sudden bright spark of clarity broke across his face. He worked it out entirely on his own. The pure, unguarded pride in his expression was worth more than anything I had ever earned or accumulated. For decades, I had poured my wealth into the bottomless appetite of family entitlement. I had written check after check to cover Caleb's cascading corporate failures. I had quietly funded Naomi's relentless need to impress people who would never truly respect her. I had believed that insulating them from every hardship was the highest expression of a father's love, that providing a smooth, frictionless existence was my fundamental duty. But standing here beside these fiercely driven young people, I finally understood the full scale of the damage I had inflicted on my own children. These students treated their materials with care because they knew exactly what it cost to obtain them. They respected my time because they genuinely valued what I had to teach. They did not look at me expecting a handout. They looked at me hoping to learn how to build their own sturdy foundations. I was finally directing my energy toward people who actually wanted to learn how to stand rather than waiting to be carried. The afternoon drifted slowly into a cool, crisp evening. The construction crews shut down their heavy machinery, and the deep rumbling of the engines faded out across the valley. The students gathered their graphite pencils, their rolled blueprints, and their notebooks, thanking me warmly for my time and guidance before heading out. I watched them move down the long gravel driveway, talking animatedly among themselves about the projects ahead. They carried a raw, powerful resilience that my own children had long since surrendered. I was fully aware that Caleb and Naomi were out there somewhere in the cold, unforgiving world, fighting to make rent and grinding through exhausting entry-level jobs. I knew they were swallowing the bitter, humbling taste of failure and learning what it meant to live paycheck to paycheck. It was painful. It was necessary. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the broad 50 acres of land. The affordable housing project was already taking visible shape in the distance, offering safe and well-built homes to hard-working families. I lifted my coffee mug and took a slow, deep sip of the dark, bitter liquid. The evening wind moved across my face, carrying the clean scent of turned earth and pine. I thought about Loretta and her clear, pragmatic wisdom. I thought about how long it had taken me to truly hear her warnings. Real love is never about funding someone's bottomless appetite for more. It is not about placing cushions beneath them every time they stumble, or concealing their failures behind a checkbook. Real love is having the immense, heartbreaking strength to step out of the way and let them fall. It means allowing them to meet the hard ground, so they can learn at last how to brace themselves, tend their own wounds, and stand on their own feet. The sun dropped fully below the horizon, painting the Virginia sky in deep shades of violet and indigo. The warm lights of my new downsized craftsman-style home flickered on, throwing a gentle glow across the wooden deck. I stood there entirely alone, and I did not feel a trace of loneliness. I had finally set down a weight that was never mine to carry in the first place. The frantic, incessant calls demanding money were gone for good. The corrosive stress of their manipulation had lifted completely. I leaned against the railing and simply breathed in the cool night air and smiled. I closed my eyes and let the deep, unbroken quiet of a genuinely peaceful life settle over me completely. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly. This story deserved a witness, and you gave it one. Looking back, what Gerald went through cost him something most people never expect to lose, the comfortable belief that love alone is enough to make people honorable. He gave his children everything, and what he got in return was a forged signature on a loan document and a conservatorship filing designed to bury the evidence. The road back to peace was long, and it was lonely. But I believe God has a way of rewarding the patient, of holding a reckoning in reserve until the moment it lands with the most clarity. Gerald didn't just survive what his children did to him, he turned it into something that will outlast all of them. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. If someone only reaches for you when the money is involved, that is not love, that is leverage. Know the difference early. Generosity given without honesty is not kindness. It is a slow way of teaching someone that they never have to earn anything. When the people you raise try to use the law as a weapon against you, document everything, trust the right counsel, and let the truth do the work. And finally, your legacy is not what you leave in a will. It is what you build on purpose for people who never expected anything from you at all. This is the kind of family revenge story that doesn't let you go easily. If you're part of the adults of a 50-plus community, you know the weight of these choices. You've seen what entitlement can do to a family, and you understand why Gerald's decision took the kind of courage most people never find. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have thoughts on Gerald, on the children, on any of it, leave them in the comments below. I read more of them than you might expect. Subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.